the issue here, though, the Japanese agreed that they would post notices in all these places that these places were used for forced labor. Are the notices posted?
No.
No. Hello, everyone. This is Mark Peterson with the Frog Outside the Well Research Center. And today, as you see, I've got my favorite guest. Hi, Chad. Hi, Chad.
Hi. How are you guys doing? Good to see you.
We just did a clip on your channel.
We did.
About Battleship Island.
Yes.
And now on my channel, we're going to talk about the history and the background and the what it means. And we talked before about the movie as the movie with a little bit of the historical, because that's what it's about, is the history. But let's talk about it in the context of not just World War II, but the Japanese occupation of Korea.
Yes.
And there were a lot of bad things that happened. And the bad things were not all just Japanese, but as the movie depicts, there were a lot of collaborators. Some of the worst actors, and I don't mean just movie actors, but actors in society, during the Japanese period were the Korean collaborators who were trying to get by themselves, trying to, make money, survive, who did some pretty bad things against their fellow men.
That's the hard thing, and that's one thing I saw in the movie that feels, the worst to me. Not that, we're forgiving or excusing how the Japanese acted, but it just feels all the much worse when you see how some of these Korean characters acted against their fellow Koreans.
Well, the Japanese, to understand their position, when the Japanese occupation began, there were a lot of Koreans that thought this was a huge step forward. Mm-hmm. It looked like the world was going to be controlled by 4 or 5 major powers, and Japan was going to be one of them. And the Koreans, a lot of Koreans were just going along with it. Mm-hmm. This idea of the freedom fighter was a very small percentage in the early days, because the average person just trying to get by, Japan looked like a good deal. And a lot of Koreans are going to get mad at me for saying that, but there were a lot of people that went along with Japan. They provided better education, better medical treatment in a modern world, leaving the dynasties behind, the royal dynasty behind, and moving to a democracy. The Japanese early on were offering Koreans a democracy. Things went bad right away. And by the time you get to the setting of this movie, you're at the height of World War II. Yeah. And in wartime, it's hard to judge any people as fair and honest, because everybody's doing the thing to win the war. And one of the things they were doing, the Japanese were doing, was recruiting Koreans and other conquered territory. Chinese. There were Chinese and Koreans were both conscripted to work in this mine. Mm-hmm. And so on the one hand, you've got to understand Japan from the perspective of deep in the war and trying to win the war. And I think many of them thought working in a mine is better than being in the battlefront.
Okay.
In the battlefront, you can catch a bullet and die. Yeah. In the mine, at least you might survive.
I mean, do you think going in you could possibly know, right? It's not.
And you don't know.
I don't think you would know, because, what I know about mines is from movies.
Yeah.
It's not like you can just head over to the cinema and see how awful the conditions would be.
And this movie does a good job of recreating that mine situation. Yeah. I think that was quite authentic. I think mines were pretty gruesome. Yeah. And you had accidents like the runaway car. Yeah. You had accidents all over the place. We've got coal mines here in Utah where a few years ago there was a terrible explosion and like 12, 15 guys were trapped. Mm-hmm. And then they sent in the rescuers without proper setup, and rescuers died. So mines can be awful places. And I have a personal note on this. My grandfather was a miner.
Really?
From Sweden, out in Eureka, out here.
Wow.
And another personal note, he died in the 1918 flu epidemic.
Oh, wow. So now we got our own
flu epidemic. So it's all coming home again.
Yeah.
The thing about the movie that I wanted to point out from the historical point of view is I think the movie was created in response to the fact that Japan got UNESCO recognition for the movie. Or for the
island.
For the island, for the mine. And Korea and Japan and a lot of countries in the world are competing to see who can get the most UNESCO recognition. Mm-hmm. And Japan just recently put together the industrial sites of the Meiji period that shows the transformation from the tribal state, meaning the shogun, to the modern state. Yeah. And they have 11 sites that they had designated, and this Battleship Island was one of the 11. And the reason it was designated was because it was one of the first significant coal mines. Now, I looked up coal mines in Japan, and you don't have coal mines in Hawaii. You don't have coal mines in volcanic islands.
Right.
But Japan has enough of an overall geologic structure that there are some coal mines in the mainland as well. But the thing that's really interesting about this coal mine is it's an island 9 miles off the southern shore of Japan.
Right.
And apparently it was a real good mine. And apparently they first found coal on the surface.
Wow.
And then started digging and digging. And it's produced, I've seen the figure, so many 100,000 tons of coal. And they went deeper and deeper. And at the time that the movie was set, they're 1,000 meters under the water.
That's
down
crazy.
deep. It's crazy, and it's also hot. I saw an interview with a survivor who's 100 years old now.
Oh my goodness.
Who lives in Daegu. He's blind from the mining. But he said it was hot, and hot, steamy work. So they had hardly any clothes on at all, just a loincloth.
Yeah,
down
and
there.
they showed that in the movie.
And these days you mine with machines, but in those days it's just pick an axe, just hauling it
just
out.
loaded it in the cart.
Yeah, piece at a time, So it's just really awful work. Yeah. Well, the place was named the UNESCO World Heritage Site, which upset the Koreans and the Chinese. And they stipulated that they could vote for it on the UNESCO panel, provided that they put in a note that I think it was 7 of these 11 sites were used as forced labor sites. Wow. Where Koreans had to come in and work in the steel mills and in the coal mines and these other modernization things. So I think that was the reason the Koreans said, hey, let's make a movie about this.
Yeah.
Another thing about this place is not historical, but just geographically, it looks like a battleship.
It does.
As you get out there, as you get closer to it. I checked on the size of it. It's a time and a half bigger than an aircraft carrier.
Yeah.
So it's bigger than a battleship, but from a distance, it really is about the right size. Yeah. An aircraft carrier is about 1,000 feet long, and this is 1,500 feet long. Okay. So it really looks like a battleship. Another interesting thing historically is that it's now considered one of the largest ghost cities in the world.
Wow.
Because nobody lives there anymore.
Yeah, of course.
It was abandoned in 1974, I think. They kept it going for a long, long time. Wow. There was a lot of coal down under there, and Japan is resource poor. They have only a few coal mines, no oil wells or anything. They have to import all their oil the way Koreans do. And so historically, as a coal mine, it was really a significant place. And the place is not very big, but they go down.
Just keep digging deeper.
Yeah, to find the coal. The issue here, though, the Japanese agreed that they would post notices in all these places that these places were used for forced labor. Are the notices posted? No. They've skipped on that part of it. Japan is very concerned about. I've seen it in numerous places where they talk about hurting their image. Right. And that's one reason for the denialism of the comfort women, the forced labor, is they don't want to hurt their image. And it's really unfortunate because Japan ought to face the music like Germany does. Yeah. Germany says, yeah, the Nazis did all that stuff, but that's not us. Yeah. The Japanese say, yeah, that they did all that and that is us.
And I feel like, by hiding it, you almost become a collaborator of it, right? Yeah. You become more responsible for the lack of healing by hiding it. So there are Japanese who say, yes, we ought to own this and thereby get rid of it. But there are many Japanese, more the conservative circle, the government circle, that say, no, it never happened. Let's not teach it in the history books and all of this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So the issue here is forced labor. Mm-hmm. And it goes along with the other egregious sin of the Japanese of the comfort women. Yeah. And both are forced labor, but this is in the mines. And yet you feel sorry for a lot of the descendants of these people, that they're still survivors of Koreans forced to labor in the mines in Sakhalin. Wow. Sakhalin has coal way up north, and the Japanese controlled Sakhalin back then. The Russians control it now that the war is over. Yeah. But there are descendants of Koreans that are still in Sakhalin Island. Wow. I've met a few. Have you?
Yeah. And they're still sort of Korean, but they're very Russian
Right.
these days, and they were very Japanese back in those days.
Yeah.
So this forced labor, the Russians are very guilty of it too, moving Koreans around to Central Asia.
Mm-hmm.
But the issue here is this forced labor and abuse of human rights that the Japanese haven't really owned up to.
One thing I am curious about is, we talked about that, Mitsubishi owning Hashima Island.
Yeah.
I don't think Mitsubishi makes cars anymore in the U.S. Do they? I feel like
I've seen them recently. I don't know about.
I feel like they're older cars.
Maybe so. But Mitsubishi's been around for a long time, and they're of course one of the great Zaibatsu, one of the Chebol.
Right.
But I don't know. I don't want to use the word war crime for Mitsubishi, but there's a lot of.
I honestly, I don't really have a problem with using it, just because I think you see stuff like this where it's like clearly they're profiting off this.
Yeah.
And they were war crimes. Regardless of who they're committed by as individuals, there are as the organization, they're the ones funding this. And it brought me back to when we had the whole Ramsayer thing going on.
Yeah, I was just going to say
the Mitsubishi professor.
Ramsayer is the Mitsubishi professor of legal institutions of Japan. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like every time I learn something about Mitsubishi, I'm like, who are they? I don't know. And it feels like they've done these things, and they're taking that parts that some of the Japanese government is doing as well, where covering stuff up.
Yeah.
And so that was the whole Ramsayer thing. Covering up.
And looking at that, the Mitsubishi made the what they called the Japanese Zero, the fighting plane. That was also the kamikaze plane that when they got desperate, Pearl Harbor and then beyond at the end of the war, when they didn't have enough armaments to bomb the American ships that were coming, they had these suicide bombers. They called them
kamikaze.
Kamikaze, yeah. And so Mitsubishi made the planes that were the kamikaze planes that dived into the American ships that terrorized the American Navy so much. They said there was nothing worse. They couldn't do anything to defend themselves from the kamikaze pilots.
Wow.
Yeah. So on the one hand, it was a very dark time. The movie describes a very dark situation. It was very dark. There was a lot of evil that took place back then. And among the evil, the two that's really come to the forefront today, that Korea would like to see Japan offer some resolution to, are the comfort women and the forced labor situation. Yeah. So if we could get some resolution on that, I think we'd have a better relationship between Korea and Japan today.
I think so too, and I think it's what it always comes back to, is that denialism is just prolonging the problem. And
we need to strengthen the hand, if we can do that, of the Japanese in Japan that are in favor of owning up to it and moving on, as opposed to the side of Japan that doesn't want to own up to it, that says it hurts our image, and the denialism.
I think denialism just adds on to the damaged image. It's like, yes, maybe your image will be damaged if this all comes out. But what's going to be worse is when eventually it all does come out. It all will. Truth always comes out.
Truth comes out. Yeah.
It's going to be that much worse when you tried to hide it.
Yeah.
It's not just what happened in Japan years ago. It's what's been going on today.
And that's what this movie has done. Is has brought this up to the surface again, and has raised it to a point of discussion again. As what did happen, and was there forced labor? Yes, there was forced labor. And this movie, although the dramatics of the movie is the movie, the historical context of people being forced to work in subhuman conditions in these mines, that part is true. Yeah. So go see the movie if you've got a stomach for it. But more importantly, let's discuss it and put it on the table so that we can all help to resolve this awful historical situation.
Definitely.
So that's what we have to say. Hope you enjoyed it. Let's see your comments, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.